Mike Green, I am here in Marin County. It's late in the day. My day started at 4:30 this morning. It is now 5 o'clock at night, and I'm excited to sit down and talk with Viktor Shvets. Viktor, you're coming to me from China by way of Macquarie Global. And so you are the global strategist, or you are a global strategist for Macquarie. And I was introduced to your work by one of our viewers. And so I just wanted to say thank you, first of all, to the viewer who reached out and said, you should take a look at this. They reached out through a Twitter direct message. I'm always open to these types of introductions. And Viktor, you and I chatted a little bit before, but it's strange that we don't know each other because we've kind of been circling on some of the same themes. This general idea that you, and I'll give you full credit for having thought of it and introduced it before me, but your work has explored through both books and your writing for Macquarie a really provocative thesis, which is effectively that capitalism already died. Liberal capitalism is already dead. We just haven't identified that the body has stopped breathing yet. And something unique is happening, that we're effectively marching backwards from a 500-year experiment with liberal capitalism to what feels like a much more authoritarian or monarchical system. Expand on that. Share how you came to this realization and what your book approaches and how you break down that, or how you arrived at that conclusion.
Well, first of all, Michael, thank you for having me. You're absolutely right. Certainly for the last 10 or 15 years, I've been arguing that what we have experienced over the previous 500 years, the recipe for success, either at an individual level or at a country level, that really drove us over the last 5 centuries, might no longer apply. And what it was is the freedom to explore, the freedom to innovate, the freedom to discuss ideas, the freedom to move from one place to another. All of those freedoms are becoming less and less relevant as we go forward. The private sector signals and the primacy of private sector in driving economic outcomes is sunsetting. And the new world is emerging. And so one of the things I've discussed in my book is what I call Fujiwara effect. That's when the two hurricanes merge and become a much stronger hurricanes. To my mind, those two hurricanes are technology and information age and financialization. Now, financialization happens to be a self-inflicted wound, but technological innovation is the human spirit. It's our ingenuity. But the speed with which technological innovation progresses depends on the cost of capital. The lower the cost of capital, the faster technological innovation progresses and penetrates our life. And so it's really the merger of the two things. Our financializing our economy. As we financialize our economy, we must generate more capital than we require. We become addicted to asset prices as a primary cue for most economic decisions that we make. As that continues, what you find is that cost of capital crashes because you do generate more capital than you need. And this extra capital supports your asset prices holistically, so to speak, as you go forward. And the book tries to address the question, why did we decide to financialize? Who made that decision in 1980s? If you go back through 50s, 60s, and 70s, every country in the world needed no more than $1.50 of liquidity in debt for every dollar of GDP. Today, depending on the country you look at, you need $3 to $5. In some cases, even more than that. So who made the decision? Why have we decided to financialize? And then you look at technology, and one of the chapters in the book shows the key differences between industrial age, and that's what we have experienced over the last 200-300 years, and the information age. And the key message is that everything that liberal capitalism is all about, which is capital and labor, is changing. In other words, the role and functioning of capital is changing rapidly. The role and functioning of labor is changing rapidly. Societal norms are changing rapidly. And so these are the two forces sort of driving us towards a black hole. And the question then becomes, what lies on the other side of the black hole? And the answer to me was, and my editors were recommending I don't use that word, but I did, I describe it as enlightened communism. That whatever lies on the other side will not be liberal capitalism as we used to have, as we sort of got to know over the last several hundred years, but communism. But communism, in a sense, the way Karl Marx thought of communism, and that is a high productivity society at a level that slavery of labor, slavery of work, disappears completely, and society gets rewired. Now, that's not dissimilar to what John Maynard Keynes was describing in 1930 when he looked at the future of our grandchildren 4 generations from now. It's actually not dissimilar to what Peter Drucker was discussing in late 1980s, in early 1990s. But for Karl Marx in 1850s, that was way off. John Maynard Keynes was closer. Peter Drucker was closer still. But the reality of it actually will hit us in the next 2 decades. And the closer you get to the black hole, the more your body stretches, the more your atoms stretch, the more your perception of reality stretches, the more your economic models, your investment models change. And that will be our sort of road over the next 2 decades. One of the keys from the book is that freedom in that system becomes optional, that you don't need to have the same degree of freedom to explore, to innovate, to exchange ideas, to move. And China, the place, as you suggest, I'm speaking from, is actually trying to prove today that freedom is indeed optional in the system. And one of the things books suggest is what policies can we put in place in order to keep as much of those freedoms as possible. Clearly, we're not going to be as free as we used to, but can we please at least keep some of those freedoms? And what I do, I explore 4 or 5 policies that can actually help us in that transition.
So before we go on to the policy prescriptions, because I always think this is an interesting distinction. I've talked about this in the context of modern monetary theory, that there's a distinction between description and the actual prescription, what you believe should be done in response to it. One of the things I find so fascinating about your description of the system is that it feels so intuitively correct to me, right? So what you're dating to roughly 500 years ago, I would describe broadly as the age of exploration and discovery, right? So the introduction of cross-Atlantic and circumnavigation, where we radically expanded the quantity of land that was available to, in particular, the Western societies, beginning with the Portuguese and the exploration along the African coast. What we saw in that environment, I mean, is quite fascinating when you think about it in the context of the exploration that could happen today. It was effectively the cost of exploration, the technological change of exploration made available to privately funded individuals or corporations, right? So the Mayflower Corporation or the Dutch East India Company, they were able to raise capital and pursue in a semi-private public partnership the exploration of untapped resources effectively, right? Dramatically expanding what I've described elsewhere as the labor surplus. And as those costs continued to fall, not just in terms of the actual mechanical costs, what it cost to mount an expedition, because you didn't have to build a new ship, you already had a ship. The navigation technologies and awareness improved so that ships were less likely to crash and sink in a hurricane, et cetera, right? We figured out those processes. It became more and more reliable, and so the costs fell, even though the technology didn't change all that much. Obviously, steam power had a huge impact there, et cetera. So we saw this continual fall in exploration that led to the exploitation of effectively the New World, right? You could come to the United States, make an investment of 3 months if we're talking 300 years ago, and 3 weeks if we're talking 100 years ago, that would transport you to a place where the land surplus was great enough that you radically changed your economic standing simply by virtue of that transition. And you also took advantage of the old Chinese proverb, the mountains are high and the emperor is far away, right? So you were able to look at the nobility, at the elite within your society and say, I now have an exit voice. If I don't like what you're doing, I'm going to take advantage of my freedom and choose to change my lot in life. What I love about what you're describing, and I hate what you're describing, I just want to emphasize that, but what I love about the description that you have provided is that it really helps us understand how things are changing, because the refrain that I always hear from people now is, well, where are you going to go? Right? It was New Zealand for a brief period of time. I'm going to spend $150,000 and get a New Zealand passport, and I'm going to pick up, and I'm going to move to New Zealand. And now New Zealand is firmly locked down. No entry, no exit, should you not choose to. I'm not disputing whether that's being done by what people perceive to be democratic standards, but the reality is there has been a dramatic devolution of freedom in Australia, in New Zealand, in the United States, and elsewhere around the developed world that would have been hitherto unimaginable 20 years ago. Right? Even a year ago, I think people would have been really challenged to think in these terms. Is there anything I'm describing that you would react to and say, no, that's crazy. You totally misunderstand what I'm saying?
No, Michael, you're absolutely correct. The only thing one can argue a little bit with is that it's really what you describe as a Western experience. You did not describe experience of Mongols, of Ottomans, of Russia, of China. And remember, if you go back to 12 to 1400s, 60% of global economy was really China as well as India. The rest was very, very peripheral. So when you describe the voyages, you have to remember that Chinese predated Western voyages by hundreds of years. You have to remember that Chinese junks in late 1300, early 1400 already had bulkhead design. They already had compass. They already were exploring Indian Ocean. They were going as far as Africa, east and west coast of Africa. If you think of the Ottomans, Persians and Arabs were the primary merchants. It was not the Europeans who were doing it. And so the question, one of the things the book explores, is that why in that critical period, some civilizations decide to commit suicide, both politically and economically, and why another civilization decided to embark on a completely different course. And the answer really, it's sort of a mixture of critical junctions. In other words, there are times when the world really changes. So, for example, when Mongols swept across the steppes, that really changed the history of Eurasia and completely reshaped Russia, coincidentally, and China in that period. The same applied to the Black Death. The same applies to Renaissance and to the reawakening of human spirit. There are those critical junctions. And when you get there, depending on the decisions you make, initially, it doesn't make much difference, actually. And even as late as 1600, China was still far more prosperous than what you find anywhere globally. But then it accumulates, and it accumulates more and more. And the interesting question is why societies persist with wrong decisions when sort of pernicious effects of those decisions are evident by that stage for everybody to see. But there is this resistance to change. And you can see it actually even today in a Western society. There is this resistance to change, resistance to accept a difference. So, as I said, the only proviso, what you describe as a Western experience, you did not describe experience of majority of the population and indeed majority of the countries. But then stepping forward, I think you are absolutely right that we're coming to the next major junction. So if you are Russia, if you are Mongols, if you are India, if you are Ottomans, you've missed your industrial revolutions. You've missed those turning points. But now there is a new turning point coming. It is reshaping societies. It is reshaping economies. It is reshaping capital markets. As you correctly said, you can't just progress through Smithian growth. In other words, using the same technology, just spreading it over wider terrain than you did prior to that. You have to have sort of Schumpeterian growth. You have to have much more disruptive growth. And that growth increasingly is coming at the expense of the labor market. It increasingly coming at the expense of conventional capital and how conventional capital functions. And that's a difference. Over the last 300-400 years, labor was a primary productivity driver. And that's why we needed to educate people. That's why we eliminated illiteracy. That's why we progressed to college education, because younger people were supposed to become more productive as you progress and support all the generations, support the countries and progress. In information age, labor is suffering from what I describe as declining marginal utility and declining marginal pricing power. Every day you sit in that chair, your marginal pricing power declines. And you know it. You feel it. No matter what your profession is, you feel it. Now, with COVID right now, there is huge dislocations. Perhaps you don't feel it as much as you did 18 months ago. But as soon as COVID sort of is out of the way, you will feel it again, that you're becoming less valuable. Now, the first people to feel it is anybody who is dealing with digits of information. In other words, trading on New York Stock Exchange, providing information, entertainment, songs, writing articles, anything where you exchange purely information. But over the next 20 years, it's all going to be about disintermediation of atoms, of physical matter. In other words, factories will disappear, supply chains will disappear. Gradually, construction workers will not be required. So gradually, you spread it wider. Eventually, there is a singularity, and that is when you can't differentiate human and non-human contribution. So part of the reason why we resent foreigners is that when your marginal utility and when your marginal pricing power declines on a daily basis, you suffer from Maslowian disappointment. You're disappointed in your life. You're disappointed that your children, you think, might not have as good life as what you are going to have. And so almost inevitably, you start looking inward. And that is a recipe for protection. That is a recipe for deglobalization. That is a recipe for restriction of immigration flows. And exactly the same thing happening to capital. Industrial age was incredibly capital intensive. This is the time, as you correctly said, of steam. This is the time of railways. This is the time of highways, of cars, of factories, of machinery. Now, the last 20 years were much less capital intensive. The next 20 years will be a little bit more than what we were spending in the previous 20 years, but we're not going back to industrial age. So we live in a societies that are less capital intensive. And not only it's less capital intensive, but the capital is much more flexible. It actually can be deployed in a variety of ways across a variety of industries. That capital offers synergistic benefits, spillover benefits. Suddenly one industry competes against the other. They didn't even know they were competitors yesterday, but today they know it. And so capital is much more flexible, much more wider spread, doesn't require as much as it used to, provides all sorts of synergies, all sorts of spillovers, disrupts industries, disintermediate corporates from their brands, from their distribution systems, from their products. And at the same time, because we financialized, and we financialized because we felt we deserve wealth that we don't deserve. In other words, despite our declining productivity, societies insisted that we must maintain economic growth rates and we must maintain wealth creation. When people say, who is to blame for what happened? My answer is, when you shave in the morning, if you're a man, look yourself in the mirror. It's you. It's not central banks. You asked. And the politics delivered exactly on what you asked. And what you ask is a perpetual wealth creation. So as we financialized, what actually happened is that we're creating more capital than we need. So for the first time in human history, we are flooded in capital. We have at least 5-10 times more capital than we need. It is not evenly distributed. It is not fairly distributed, but there is plenty of it. And so the result is that what you have is that cost of capital must continue to fall. And if cost of capital falls, technology accelerates even more as you go forward. So to answer your question, why did we have Donald Trump? Why do we have Boris Johnson? Why do we have Conte in Italy? Why do we have Xi Jinping in China? Why do we have Modi in India? The answer is disrupted environment. Very similar to what happened during the first industrial revolution. There is a reason why Karl Marx penciled his Communist Manifesto in 1848. That was a peak of disruption. that was created by the first industrial revolution. Suddenly, the nobility didn't know what their social responsibilities were. Artisans suddenly saw factories springing up everywhere. They no longer were artisans, they're becoming slaves of the factory system. Suddenly peasants were no longer looking up to the lord of the manor. And so it was incredibly disrupted society. And this is exactly what we're seeing now. And in that disruption, the impulse is to protect yourself, to protect your society, to blame the foreigners, to blame the policymakers. And it's incredibly fertile ground for any demagogue, for any populist, because people are asking for help. And even though populists very seldom deliver that help, it is, as I said, it's incredibly fertile ground for it.
When you think about that, because you brought up a number of points there, and I agree with you completely that people tend to forget the context of what was occurring around Marx, that it was this huge inflection that led to or was part of an upheaval of the traditional institutions that existed in society, right? There was effectively a search for new organizational methods, new ways that individuals could come together either in unionization or in guilds or in limited liability corporations to pursue all sorts of interesting stuff because we had this substantive change, right? And you bring up the dynamic of the elites, part of the end of the medieval period and the transition out of even the Renaissance and into the Industrial Revolution was the stripping of peasants of their traditional lands in the enclosure movements, right? So that consolidation and that focus led to many of these changes, displaced a lot of these workers who would have historically been in relatively low productivity, high fertility, meaning child production environments, where they were taking care of sheep, they were grazing in the common lands, they were subsisting in largely homespun environments where they made their own clothes, grew their own food, et cetera, right? And paying taxes in kind in the form of rent to a lord, where there's very little actually happening in a broader market economy, right? The productivity associated with the Industrial Revolution and the early stages of that, the need to grow wool, for example, for industrial production in looms, that upset the apple cart, right? Now, the solution set that existed at that time that I would argue postponed the visions of Marx and others was the existence of an incredible land surplus in the New World. Effectively, the ability for people to pick up and say, we're going to go, right? And you saw this in particular in places like Scandinavia, where 30% of the adult male population emigrated to the United States, creating conditions of significant labor scarcity and giving rise to the socialist or the social safety net phenomenon. But today we don't have that, right? As a matter of, again, this refrain of where do you go indicates that there has been a substantial rebalancing of that negotiating leverage, that effectively labor has no real recourse against the elites. It's almost like we're back in the enclosure movement, right? If Jeff Bezos decides that he wants to fire me, oh well. All right, what am I going to do?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Michael. For the Western societies, because again, we're not talking about non-Western societies.
Absolutely, and I definitely want to visit the Eastern society component of it because I think that's fascinating.
For the Western societies, you're absolutely right that as a pressure increased in Western Europe, the let out was the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, all of those countries. 62 million Europeans moved out of Europe between sort of 1830s, 1840s and early 1900s. In some places like Ireland, like Norway, like Portugal, 40% of workforce just disappeared. At the same time, US or Canada or any of those places did not have enough labor, did not have enough expertise, but had plenty of resources that you could utilize. And so it was a very nice rebalancing that both areas, the older Europe as well as the New World, benefited from. I think going forward, not only what you've just described is true, that there is no new frontiers, but more importantly, in the industrial age, people were the primary productivity drivers. You couldn't do anything without people. Increasingly, people are marginalized. So in other words, not only you have nowhere to go, but you actually are not needed. Even at $1 an hour wages, we no longer require you. Now, it's not yet evident to everybody, particularly now with COVID and disruptions, but that's been a process since at least late 1980s. If you think the first area to be affected was really PC and enterprise-based area, this is your rationalization of vice presidents, information system. Remember, in late 80s, it could have taken CEO a week to figure out what's going on with his company. By late 90s, he could get this information in a day or less than a day. And so the first area to feel it was all regarding sort of intra-company, government, security services. It was not so much consumer-oriented. It's sort of the world of Sun Microsystems and Cisco and IBM and Dell and Ericsson and companies like that. After 2000, it's gone mainstream. And that was predominantly digit manipulation, predominantly consumer-oriented. Remember that Amazon in 2000.com crash was a tiny company. Google didn't even exist. Alibaba didn't even exist. All of them become really titans over the last sort of 15 years or so. Now, that period very quickly disintermediated a lot of people. So if you're a journalist in early to mid 90s, and if you're a journalist today, these are two completely different worlds you're inhabiting. If you're an entertainer in early to mid 90s, so if you're an entertainer today, this is two completely different universes you're inhabiting. If you are if you're a trader, for example, I was based in New York in early 2000s. We used to have 300-400 traders in New York. Today, we only have like 5 left. So if you were trading a stock exchange or currencies or commodities, you today inherit a very different world than what you did back 20 or 30 years ago. So those people, whether you're an accountant, whether you're a trader, whether you're a journalist, whether you're an entertainer, you know the world has changed profoundly. But if you're a truck driver, if you're a construction worker, if you are an electrician, if you're a plumber, you don't yet see it, but it's coming. It's coming for you. And the same process will work through that. So one of the things that I've sort of described in the book, and I describe in my research as well, is that apart from the fact that there is nowhere to go, you no longer need it. And so one of the arguments with a basic income guarantee or minimum income guarantee is that it's not so much it encourages laziness, but it compensates for growing irrelevance of what you are and what you do. And as I said, with the next 20 years, factory workers, construction workers, truck drivers will feel it. As soon as we have air conditioning units that don't have any moving parts, suppliers will feel it. And so as gradually you go through this process, it will be wider and wider and wider. I said, eventually you get to the stage that PhD in computer science will feel it as well. And that's sort of getting close to your singularity. And so what basic income guarantee tries to do is basically reduce social pressures arising from growing irrelevancy of what you are as an individual, or what you are as a labor or contributor. Now, that's much more disruptive than industrial revolution. I think McKinsey at one stage calculated that the impact of information age is about 3,000 times the impact of industrial revolution, meaning it impacts a lot more industries. It's got 300 times the waterfront, and it progresses 10 times faster than industrial revolutions were. And perhaps one more point, people are sometimes surprised that technology leads to lower productivity, not higher productivity. And people say maybe we mismeasure productivity. We don't mismeasure. Whenever you look at the first industrial revolution or second industrial revolution, it takes roughly 5 decades for the benefit to spread widely enough and to be accepted widely enough for aggregate productivity to rise. In the meantime, productivity falls because what happens, productivity rises very rapidly in the areas directly in line of fire. In other words, if you're a biotech guy today, if you're a IT guy today, if you're a computer coder today, you're seeing a massive increases in productivity and compensation levels. However, if you're a commercial banker today, you don't see it. If you are a factory worker, you only see it because of COVID, but otherwise you don't really see it. And so what happens is that areas of economy that are improving in productivity kill the rest of the economy one cut at a time. And they kill it slowly and painfully. And so the aggregate productivity cannot rise. It only rises when we stop warehousing people in what one of the academics used to describe bullshit occupation. So what I mean to say, as soon as we stop warehousing people, as soon as we stop trying to employ people, productivity will mushroom. Before first industrial revolution, productivity was 0.1% per annum. After the first industrial, it was about 50, 60 bips. After the second industrial, it was like 1.5%, 2%. We're now down back to below 1%. But as soon as we stop warehousing people, it will mushroom to 3, 4, 5% incredibly fast. But we must stop warehousing people. And one way of trying to bridge this gap is your basic income guarantee. Also, at the same time, you have to remember that technology progresses in stages. It's not just one revolution. Technology today progressed far enough to reduce your marginal pricing power, to reduce your marginal utility, to reduce satisfaction that you derive from your life, but not far enough to displace you completely. And so what you're doing, you're sitting in the chair, you're being warehoused effectively, pending your final disposal in a form or manner in which society ultimately will find it acceptable. But whilst you're warehoused, as I said, the productivity rates have difficulty really rising.
Well, and what you're describing can be thought of in a slightly, I mean, the first of all, this is empirical evidence to support what you're saying. So since in the United States, since 1990, every recession has been characterized by a surprising feature that didn't exist in prior recessions, what has become known as colloquially as the jobless recoveries is a rise in productivity accompanying the reduction in employment. We effectively end up producing more with fewer people because we've reduced the surplus labor that has been warehoused. Now, as I sit in my chair and I feel like warehoused labor, you know, I take that somewhat personally, but at the same time, what you're saying is 100% correct. I see it within our industry where, you know, 2 decades ago, 3 decades ago, when I got started, the idea that I could add individual value by studying individual companies, et cetera, was extraordinarily high, right? It was the effort that you put in, the productivity of a single high quality analyst was extraordinary. And today we all know that we all feel irrelevant in that process. There's another interesting phenomenon, though, that accompanies a lot of that. If we go back to prior periods where this has been the case, and again, the last 500 years has been somewhat of an exception. If we go back to the pre-enclosure movement type dynamic, many of the things that feel like personal affronts and mysteries in a Western experience, things like the rising difficulty of affording ownership of a home or the inability to found and run your own business, those start to make sense in the context of what you're saying, right? Because if I go back 500 years ago, I couldn't own my own home. The vast majority of people were somehow or another, you know, engaged in service to the local manor, as compared to having the degree of freedom and independence. And so one of the things that always scares me as I look at rising asset prices is maybe this is just a rational reorganization of society back to that environment where we're looking at the very unfortunate situation that you won't own your own home. You won't actually control your future in that way. And bemoaning it, you can certainly choose to protest. You can certainly choose to resist it. And I realize I sound like I'm describing the Borg from Star Trek and that this is insanely depressing. And I think that there is an element of true loss that we do have to accept and understand the grieving associated with it. But it is very difficult to see how it reverses. It's very difficult.
I agree completely. I mean, we can cry over spilled milk, but the reality is there is no way of going forward. And it's not just your house. It's essentially property rights as such. If you think of industrial age, one of the success stories of liberal capitalism was secure and impartial property rights or asset rights in general, whether it's a right to your invention that you can then exploit over a period of your license, be 20, 25 years, whether it's ownership of your home. Secure property and asset rights was something that clearly differentiated West from the rest. That was not the case in Russia. That was not the case in China. In many ways, that was not the case for Ottomans and most non-Western civilizations. In those civilizations, even today, your rights are contingent. They're not absolute. So you do have your right to property in China or Russia, so long as you do what you're supposed to do. So in other words, as Russians used to say, so long as you're in the service of the Tsar. Now, that doesn't mean that there is complete anarchy of property rights. But what it does mean, there was no certainty of property rights. They were contingent on your relationship to the state. Now, the excellent thing about the West, and that's one of the things that differentiated, is that it was not contingent. It was absolute rights that you enjoyed. And so if you go forward, increasingly the most important things in our economies do not reside in physical assets. And because they don't reside in the physical assets, it's incredibly difficult to enclose it. How do you patent a sequence of a code in information? How do you patent what we do? And so one of the things is that the importance of property rights, the importance of impartial and absolute property rights is diminishing. Because increasingly they're residing in what Rifkin called commons. They are available to almost everybody. They can be accessed by almost everybody. And so we're returning back to more feudal times, where instead of owning a property, you had the right of access. You had a right to use, but you didn't actually own it. And so we would sort of go back to that. And so the question then becomes, who actually owns it? Well, increasingly, what society is saying is that government must step in. Government must be the guardrail. So if you go back to 1950s and 1960s, for example, the first generation of economists, macroeconomists, did not believe that there was a huge difference between public and private sector. They did not believe that private sector is always necessarily more efficient at allocating capital. That came later in 1970s with Milton Friedman, with Ronald Reagan, with Maggie Thatcher, with Ronald Coase. Now, that's the idea of primacy, that private sector is always better, and whatever problem you have, private sector solution is always better. That idea died at least 10, 15 years ago. And what society is increasingly demanding is that the government is a guardrail. Very similar what people felt in 1950s. Very similar. And so it becomes a guardrail. If it becomes a guardrail, what should the government do? And that is where the West is debating. There is no need to debate it in China. In China, government is everything. It's central banks, it's banks, it's money, it's operations, it's usage of money, it's everything. But in the West, we do have a separation between the two. And so the question that becomes, what role should it play? Increasingly, society is insisting that certain rights are human rights. They're not businesses. And so, for example, basic income guarantee, human right. Affordable housing, human right. Affordable healthcare, human right. Access to broadband, human right. There is a number, education, human right. So increasingly societies in the West are demanding that all of that must be regulated by the state, quite often must be distributed by the state, and it shouldn't be left to the private sector. And so one of the things that is happening, the nature of property rights is changing. the importance of property rights in changing. More and more value resides in the commons that are not really surrounded by the walls of property rights and licensing and the rest of it. And at the same time, the society insists that the government must provide the guardrail against the chaos that otherwise would prevail. And the governments are responding as they have to, because politics always responds to what people have. Look at Republicans today. They're not the Republicans that we used to know. Look at Democrats today. And whether you're Labour or Conservative in the UK, policies are very similar. If you think of Liberals versus Labour in Australia, they're very similar. Nobody is talking about austerity. That idea died back in 2012. Everybody is talking about government doing more. Where they disagree is some of the areas. But they all agree that the government will play substantially greater role.
So, you bring up a really interesting point, which is that property rights are, well, first let me phrase something a little bit differently. So when I think about the descriptive books, the narrative books that have been produced in the last 20, 30 years, ranging from Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs, and Steel, to Darren Asimoglu with Why Nations Fail, et cetera, there has been a broad description of the success of the West was tied to geographic features, was tied to, viral dynamics. The bugs that we had were worse than others had elsewhere. They were tied to, where we were in the latitude framework, et cetera. You're suggesting actually something radically different, is that it was a conditional effect, that those countries that embraced the dynamic of freedom in an environment of capital surplus, or land surplus, really, it was the undeveloped capital at that point, and labor scarcity, benefited from reinforcing the individual rights associated with that. That would be your interpretation of why those books correctly explain what transpired, but they don't have to be descriptive of what works going forward. In fact, you're saying there's a very real risk it's the opposite.
Correct. Part of the reason I wrote the book was there is, as you correctly said, lots of books describing why nations fail, why have they succeeded, what was the recipe of the Western society, the role that geography, cocktail of diseases, or the role that secure property rights, institutions, culture, religion, whatever played in the success of the West compared to the East. There is also a lot of books on technology. Your Yuval Harari, your Bernstein and McCarthy. There is a lot of books on technology, how technology is changing what we do, society, but they don't actually relate back to what happened over the last 500 years. Then we have a lot of books which are mesmerized by debt. I mean, for Christ's sake, we have like $700-800 trillion piece of paper outstanding now, which is almost 10 times global GDP. Does anybody think anybody will ever repay any of that stuff? The answer is no. But there is still a preoccupation with debt servicing. So there is a lot of books that are actually describing the issues of economy, describing the issue of debt, describing how we need to reset the economies in order to return to liberal capitalism. There's a lot of history books that actually dwell on individuals, whether it's specific emperor of China or Russia, or the role that federal papers or anything else have done. But I didn't find any that actually puts it together and say, okay, this is what succeeded. This is what's happening now. This is, I think, how it's going to change, and how the formula for success is actually might be very different over the next 20 years.
So, Victor, when you bring up this idea of the obsession of debt and the idea that we're not going to pay it back, this is part of what I object to in the conversations around, we're just going to run inflationary. We're going to pay off the debt with inflation, right? That feels highly implausible to me. One, it's ahistorical. We've never seen anything like that before. And two, again, it just feels impossible to me, right? What's your reaction to that narrative and how it plays out?
Well, I usually describe to my clients that when I started in the industry in 1980s, my first crash was the Black Monday of 1987. And I remember I was sitting next to some of the older traders, and they were saying, well, that will sort out men from the boys. Well, it didn't really. And then I remember I was doing Japan in 1990-91, and everybody was saying, oh my God, the only way out of this is debasement of yen to 300-400. You need to reflate the economy. Well, it didn't. I was in London during .com, and people said, well, this is the end. This is going to have a massive reprisal. Well, it didn't. The same pretty much happened with the global financial crisis, the same happening with COVID. So this idea of comeuppance, this idea of paying for your sins, this idea of rebasing to some kind of mythical normality is just idiotic in my view, because it can't be done. And the reason it can't be done, not that we can't do it, we don't want to do it. And so every time we've come to a T-junction, whether it was 1987, 1991, 97, 2001, 2008, 2020, and people are asked, do you want to reset the economy? People say, yeah, good idea. But I must warn you, your 401k might not be worth much. And by the way, the house you're living in will be worth maybe a fraction what you paid for it. Are you okay with that? And most people say, no, I'm not okay with that. And so the way I basically describe it, every time we come to a T-junction, people rejected liberal capitalism, and people insisted on some version of communism. Now, the only way you can reconcile those two conflicting demands was through continuous financialization, bringing future consumption to the present in order to support the level that you believe is appropriate. That can only be done by hooking you to asset prices and using asset prices as a guide to make a decision whether to save or consume, whether to invest or to do share buybacks and the rest of it. Now, there are consequences to that, and the consequences are income and wealth inequalities. The consequence of that are the more you do it, the more cost of capital collapses. The consequences are zombie companies survive that otherwise would not have survived because cost of capital is so low. The consequences are that technology and technological progression accelerates massively. So there are consequences in that. But that is what we have decided. And so we reach a stage now that there is no going back. If we wanted to debate virtues or vices of debt, we should have had this debate in the 1980s. That train left the station a couple of decades ago. And so from now on, we have to go forward. And so the idea of deleveraging is very bad. In fact, it can't be done without very serious consequences. And so what central banks, certainly for the last 10 years, I want to argue in the case of Japan for more than 25 years, what they were doing is threading the needle between trying to avoid compression of debt and credit, compression of liquidity and asset prices on the one side, and trying to minimize or at least modulate the credit risks that you are riding. So nobody is deleveraging. Nobody is trying to return back to normality. Everybody is trying to minimize the risk while recognizing that we must continue to financialize, we must continue to leverage, we must continue to lubricate the system as we go forward. Now, a lot of people say, how do we break it? How do we break this cycle? Well, the only way, first of all, you can't break it. But the only way you can try to make it less impactful is by introducing fiscal policies. In other words, if you just rely on monetary levers, capital stays in a cloud of finance. It doesn't actually go down to the ground where people live. And so we've created two very distinct universes. One is the financial economy, and the other one is real. Financial economy demands more and more capital insatiably. Real economy has problem digesting all of this debt and capital. And so the central banks are the linchpin between the two very different economies, responding to very different signals. And so one way of trying to reconcile it to some extent or to minimize the negative impact is through fiscal policy. And fiscal policy basically reflects desire of societies to put capital exactly where people want it to be Not in Picasso paintings, not in Hampton's mansions, not in speculating on various financial instruments, but exactly where people would like it to see. And that's what the government have been increasingly doing. Now, a lot of people say that's interfering with free market signals. What free market signals? Central banks now determining cost and volume of money. If they don't like the price, they create the price. They control the yield curve. Bank of Japan, Reserve Bank of Australia, ECB now control the yield curve. If they don't like the volume, they create volume. And if they don't like how it's multiplied, they even now increasingly lending directly to the main street and therefore bypassing the banking system altogether. And when central bank digital coin comes in, which will happen at the end of this year, early next year in China, but over the next 2 or 3 years everywhere, the capabilities that central banks will have will be even greater. So the only way to sort of reduce the negative impacts, not eliminate them, you can't eliminate them, but to reduce them, is through fiscal policies. And the key areas, clearly, are the areas that society demands are human rights.
Well, it's fascinating to think about it in that context, right? So now let's transition to the Eastern societies. And so your book focuses on Russia, the Ottomans, and China as having been dominant societies pre-industrial revolution, and really pre-age of discovery, laggards to that experience. And ultimately, as we were just discussing in the Acemoglu, et cetera, framework, failed to embrace the systems that encouraged individual freedom, risk-taking exploration, that facilitated the rise of the West. But they also retained something that you highlight, right, which is effectively a collectivist dynamic that says, we will share in our good and bad fortunes, right? That if things are getting worse, we're going to collectively share in them. Whereas in the West, the reaction is basically, well, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. If you didn't succeed, you're clearly just a failure, you as an individual, right? That seems like that can be both an advantage and a disadvantage. I think it is exactly to your point, it is state dependent, not state meaning are you Russia or the United States, meaning are you in a period of labor surplus or are you in a period of capital surplus? And so if you're in capital surplus, you need to embrace that individualism, risk-taking. You want people to take risks with capital because capital is in surplus, true capital, not financialized capital. Today, you're saying it's effectively the opposite, that we've got tons of financial capital, very little real capital needs, right? The world wouldn't know what to do if 50 more toilet paper factories came on. The world would have no idea what to do if an additional 50, state-of-the-art car factories were built, or for that matter, even chip factories, right? As much as we think about the unlimited demand for semiconductors, the reality is that by and large, they've fallen in price every single year. The capabilities have exploded. And as TSMC thinks about moving and offshoring from Taiwan, they're talking about introducing facilities in Arizona that would represent 50% of their capacity if it hits nameplate, capacity dynamics. So even in the areas of shortage, it just doesn't really exist.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We're in the world of declining marginal return and pricing on everything. Declining marginal pricing power of labor, declining marginal pricing power of conventional capital, rapidly declining marginal pricing power of financial capital. The only parts where pricing power is increasing, and that's only temporarily, is in the areas of extreme digital capital. And in other words, if you invent something, it actually does have a pricing power. But the time of that pricing power is diminishing. So in other words, in the past, invention could have given you a runway of 20 years, 25 years, 30 years. Now, sometimes it only gives you 6 months. If you're lucky. And so that starts questioning everything. Like, why do we have corporations? We have corporations to reduce transaction costs. We have corporations to mobilize capital. If we have ample financial capital, and if transaction costs on a marginal basis are declining everywhere, why do you need a corporation? Well, the answer, you probably don't. And you could go back to 17th and 18th centuries where there used to be some trading houses, that lasted for a period of time. But mostly it was ad hoc ventures that were created that would be dissolved as soon as the objective of that venture was fulfilled. And so we could see all of that disintegrating into what I describe as 1,000 stars or points of light everywhere. Now, the other thing you've described, I think, very well is that in that world of declining marginal return on labor, declining marginal return on conventional capital, surplus of financial capital, governments are the ones that are capable of relocating that capital exactly where people want it to be. Now, Western societies are generally reluctant to embrace this role because by and large, we're still mesmerized by the idea of private sector allocation of capital, sort of guided by various efficiency criteria. But as I said earlier on, that hasn't been our world for at least 2 decades. Central banks or treasury departments really determine so many variables today than they used to. I mean, Peter Drucker once described it, even back in late 1980s, when he said that in the past, the government would try to control climate. Today, they're trying to control weather. So in the past, they will only interfere when there is something very dramatic. But today, they want to have 72 to 76 degrees Fahrenheit every day, mostly sunny, occasional cloud, but certainly no rain. And so we have lived in the world of private sector signals for a very, very long time. And so if you think of Eastern model, particularly Chinese model, not only it's much more community-based, and that's a culture that you have. Not only it is very much centralized model, even though there is a lot of competition within that model, don't get me wrong, but much more centralized model, it actually better suited potentially for that world. And the only question to ask is, first of all, can government allocate capital in even a remotely efficient manner? And number two is that can you invent, not innovate, invent? Big difference. Chinese were great innovators, but they invented nothing. And so the ancient Chinese did, but certainly in the modern time, they invented nothing. And so can you do that? And one of the things I describe in the book is that Lenin and Bukharin in the Soviet Russia in 1920s tried to introduce new economic policies, a map. And what it was basically trying to combine capitalism and socialism, trying to have government allocating capital. And they believed that government can do a better role than a very chaotic market. Now, people say they didn't understand economics. That is not true. Bolsheviks did understand economics. They just felt they can do a better job. Now, they didn't. And so Bukharin was shot. The whole thing disappeared. Allende in Chile tried to do something similar in early 1970s. Mao tried to do something similar. All of those things failed. And so one of the questions I ask in the book, should we resurrect socialist calculation debate, which raged in 1920s, 30s, and 40s, but then died in 50s? And that is it true that the government necessarily is inefficient allocator of capital? And what China is trying to prove, that what Bukharin in Russia, Bolshevik Russia, lacked was the computational power. That now, with computational power improving in leaps and bounds, that China actually has a much better ability to allocate capital, whereas Bukharin was keeping files on nails and galoshes and all the rest of it. So that's one argument that is starting to be resurrected, extent to which you can actually have the right tools for the government to allocate capital. The other argument is inventiveness. One thing we know 500 years told us, if you don't have the freedom to explore, if you don't have the freedom to question, if you don't have the freedom to sort of criticize, you can't invent. And indeed, that is true. So if you think of China, great innovator, invented nothing. If you look at any of the prize, from Nobel Prize to Mathematics Prize to Computer Science Prize, they won almost nothing. Now, China would argue a lot of Chinese heritage people did win, but they were based in the US, they were based in the UK. And so the question is whether those people, if they were still based in China, would have won those Nobel Prizes or mathematical prizes or Turing prizes or anything else. And the answer, they probably wouldn't have. And so the question is, can you invent? That comes back again to computational power and artificial intelligence. It is progressing so rapidly that it's going beyond the routine tasks. It goes beyond just replacement of menial tasks. And over the next 20 or 30 years, it is possible, not possible, it's very likely, the demand for postdocs will collapse, the value of PhDs will collapse, and increasingly you will have artificial intelligence making quite a few breakthroughs that otherwise you required human ingenuity to be able to deliver. Now, if that is true, if in fact government can allocate better, or at least not much worse, and if at the same time you don't need human ingenuity, why should you allow a professor at Beijing University to have access to international scholars or to exchange information with international scholars? And so one of the things the book argues is that over the next couple of decades, all of those questions will become important. And China is trying to prove that, yes, you need some freedom. Just like Buharin. Buharin didn't envisage it to be a prison. You do need some freedom. But the government and state allocation is paramount in this process. And at the same time, you can invent, not just innovate. Just look how quickly Trump kneecapped China last time around. And the reason is that China totally dependent on Western intellectual capital. So can you create that intellectual capital as you go forward? If the answer is yes, then freedom becomes optional. And so my argument in the book is to say, I would hate to see that world. And so there are policies and prescriptions that I think we can pursue, not to create or go back to the type of freedom that baby boomers gave us over the last sort of 3 or 4 decades, not to go back to that, but at least limit the extent to which our freedoms will be sort of constrained.
So I love, I mean, again, I hate almost everything you're saying. That is the, libertarian core of most Americans or Australians, reacting to a certain extent and saying, this can't possibly be true. But unfortunately, I would argue that I see it too much in the data. I feel it too much in my bones to argue that you're truly off base. So I want to explore just a couple of very quick components of that. The first is you highlight this dynamic of productivity and the decline in productivity. And this is actually well articulated by John Fernald at the San Francisco Fed, unintentionally, I would point out, in which he notes that effectively the productivity that many think we are mismeasuring is actually just a budgetary effect. As productivity or as ease of access of any particular good explodes, right, it collapses as a share of our purchasing basket. So nobody in the Western world really realistically thinks about obtaining their daily allotment of grain, right? Instead, we may think, can we get prepared foods for us? Can we go to Chipotle? Can we dine at the Palm? Can we do, all these sorts of things? But nobody is really thinking about coarse wheat, right? In the same way, I would argue that nobody really thinks about how do I access entertainment anymore, right? That would have been an incredible luxury where a minstrel traveling through town would show up and only for a brief period of time would he be able to take enough from the local population with his degree of novelty to begin to survive, right? So it couldn't exist in a fixed location. Today, we turn on the television and we turn on our iPad or we turn on our phone and we watch any number of entertainment components that simply distract us. I would also highlight your point about this idea of, is sharing always good, right? Because when you talk about innovation versus invention, innovation requires me to be aware of what you have done and come up with a marginally better way to do the same thing, or to combine it in a marginally novel way with something that somebody else I'm connected with. But true invention could very well require us to become disconnected, right? That it requires us, similar to a punctuated equilibrium in evolution, to have Australia separate from North America and North America separate from Europe in order to have truly, naive is the wrong word here, but it's effectively what I'm looking for, experimentation that is free to succeed or fail. And then when they come back together again, we find out which are the most robust ideas. And so is that a reasonable reading of some of the points that you're making?
Well, if I pick up the sort of the latter point first, inventiveness is a very hard thing to judge. It's basically a breakthrough. As you correctly said, it's not just aiding a little bit incrementally here or there. It's not applying an invention to a product that you try to sell and then you improve the product. So, for example, Apple hasn't invented anything. Google hasn't really invented anything. But there were inventions that occurred in 1940s and 50s and 60s, which basically underpin whatever Apple does today or whatever Google. Private sector, generally speaking, never invents. Private sector innovates. And traditionally the public sector in various forms or sort of crazy individuals, I guess, that actually do invent. But at the same time, one has to be a little bit careful because it's built on the shoulders of preceding generations. And what you find, whether you're Isaac Newton, whether you're anybody else, whether you are Albert Einstein, there were generations prior to that on which those individuals built. And so do you need to have interrelationships? Do you need to have exchange of views? Do you need to have people drilling little holes forever before they actually find anything? Do you need to have dead ends that people drill and don't find anything? The answer, yes, you do. But that final step is a brand new creation. This is what you could describe as, Bezos described day one company rather than day two in a company context. This is a brand new thing that occurs. I think Peter Thiel described as N1 versus N10. It's like this is a brand new thing. And it occurs unexpectedly sometimes, but usually it's a result of many generations ultimately coming through to that conclusion. And what we saw pretty consistently across the Muslim countries, across Russia, across China, is that inventiveness disappeared. So, for example, Muslim nations dominated inventiveness until about 1200. There was virtually nothing, very few things come through from Muslim nations prior to 1500, and there is almost nothing since 1500. If you think of China, it's earlier than that. It's between sort of 2nd century BC and say around 1300. Since then, almost nothing came through out of China, and it was the West that dominated that. And so, yes, it's a breakthrough. Yes, it occurs in different places. But the tendency so far, certainly over the last 500 years, it was completely dominated by the West. Whether it's Germany, whether it's UK, whether it's US, completely dominated by the West. And so the question becomes, if we no longer need to rely on individuals to necessarily make those breakthroughs, is it an opportunity for countries that don't have the same degree of freedom to explore, to ask, to criticize? And the answer, yes, maybe it is an opportunity for those people going forward. In terms of productivity, your first question, the way I look at it, I have a problem with mismeasurement arguments for a very simple reason that if we genuinely were mismeasuring productivity, then I think real wages would not have been stagnant. And I think income and wealth inequalities would not have been rising. I think what we do, we mismeasure it in the total, what's contributing to it, but not in aggregate. So in other words, if you think of US GDP, officially technology is, I think, only 5-6% of GDP. That is clearly wrong. So in other words, technology is undervalued, but the real conventional assets are probably grossly overvalued. So what is General Motors worth? Is it the question is the factory of General Motors, is the land on which it's built worth more than a factory? And the answer probably yes. Is General Motors brand worth something? Well, it depends how they position that brand as you go forward. So to me, it's not so much we are underestimating productivity or mismeasuring. We're mismeasuring the components. We're understating the value of digital. We're understating the value of new technology, and we grossly overvalue the conventional industrial age assets. But in aggregate, we're probably getting it at about right. And that's why income and wealth inequality has been rising and real wages have been stagnating.
Well, I also think so. I mean, this is one of the areas that I push on in this discussion is we also have to be very careful because when we talk about aggregates and we talk about rising inequality, we have changed the metrics on which we measure that, right? So I just like when you look, if you were to look on an apples to apples basis and say, what is happening to the income of and I'm going to sound horribly inappropriate when I say this, but if I look at a white married couple with 2.2 children, and I look at their income levels and how they have progressed since 1972, when ostensibly the median American worker's income stagnated, that household's income has done just fine. It hasn't accelerated at the same rate as the top, but it has continued to grow at a fairly similar rate to what transpired before. But part of what you're identifying is that the surplus that has been produced has broken the historical restrictions on alternative households. So now today we have single mothers and we have households with aged adults and no income earners who are living off of financial assets. Those households would never have existed in history. Even prior to 1972, they were exceptionally rare, right? The marginal or the median household in the United States in 1972 was a white married couple with 2.2 children. Today, it's a single mother, right? So when you're looking at that dynamic, it can mislead you in terms of the components. But I agree broadly that we certainly haven't seen an acceleration or a capture of, for the median, even on a like-for-like basis, we have seen inequality rise, right? Those at the very top are outperforming.
If you think of it that way, it's really top 1% versus the rest.
Yes.
Even if you're top 3%, you're not doing that well. It's really top
Correct.
1 versus the rest. And that's why averages are not very, very good. You really should look at the median. But more importantly, you need to look at the wealth, not at income. And if you think of the top 1% of the U.S. households, they now control 40% of net wealth of the country. If you think globally, they control about 35%. So there is great inequality in the U.S. versus the rest of the world. But both of those numbers are more than double what they used to be. And they are roughly at the same level where they used to be back in the Gilded Age of early 1900s, which, by the way, was the peak of the second industrial revolution. Surprise, surprise. And so one of the things Solo described in one of the articles correctly, he says, when we measure income inequality, we're probably measuring digital assets. We're not actually measuring income. And that's probably, it's absolutely correct. So if you are a household with access to assets, particularly digital assets, with access to the cloud of finance, your assets grew tremendously over the last 30, 40 years as we financialized and as we digitized over that period of time. If you are an ordinary couple or an ordinary individual relying on wages and household chattels like cars and refrigerators and television sets, you progressively become poorer through that period. And that's not unusual. If you think of first industrial revolution between 1760s and 1850s, 1860s, there was a massive increase in inequality. This is your Oliver Twist. This is your poorhouses. There was a massive increase in inequality. That inequality did not come down until early 1900s in the UK. So it's not that unusual to see. U.S. played out a little bit later because U.S. did not have industrialization until you reached 1850s. So it's played out with a sort of time lapse in the United States as well. So it's not unusual to see that. That's a very common feature. But the problem is when you have that, even if your family doing okay, it's all about Joneses. It's all about what other people do. Your Maslowian disappointment is not based on what you do. It's based on what you think you should be doing and what other people that you look at are doing. That's what drives it. Rather than you absolutely have become a little bit better off or a little bit worse off, or you okay. It's a relative concept.
So this brings up, I just had an interview with Matt Stoller. I don't know if you're familiar with his work at all, but he has written a book called Goliath. I have highlighted Goliath, and your book, by the way, is The Great Rupture. We should have named that instead of calling it the book, but I encourage people to read it. So Matt Stoller brings up the idea that the New Deal and the dynamics of the Roosevelt administration was a reaction, a required reaction to the growing power of corporations, that there was an alternative framework that was, evidenced most clearly in places like Italy and Germany, where corporatism effectively took over and ended up in a very, very bad place, that the United States made a choice to lean towards socialism and government control at the expense of the capital class. Now, the retelling of that, and this is part of why I enjoy your description that 20 years ago the system fractured, right, is the Amity Schleye's book, The Forgotten Man, effectively was the opposite telling of that story, right? This was the stripping of the free market's rights and the abrogation of the responsibility of the government to protect those, and the government stole it and took it away, et cetera, right? It sounds like you would lean in Matt's direction that says, hey, wait a second, that was a necessary intervention to cut back on the corporate control. Does that feel fair?
Indeed. And if you think of antitrust age, which actually started in the early 1900s and really peaked even before the FDR, it really peaked in 1920s. But that was a necessary reaction against the massive concentration of corporate power. And you have those reactions because societies ask you to have that. So in other words, societies are saying, this, we can't go on with this anymore. And so you have a choice. Do you want to have a Russian-style revolution? Is it what you want? Do you want to have a complete fusion of the state and corporate sector, which is what happened in Nazi Germany, for example? Is it your answer? Or is your answer is that the state, in a relatively benign, state can never be fully benign, but state in a relatively benign fashion will try to take the sting out of this, will try to reduce the pressures. That's the reason why Iron Chancellor Bismarck introduced the first welfare policies in Germany in 1880s. Everybody was saying, oh my God, this is the end, this is the end of capitalism as we know it. But what he was trying to do is to reduce societal pressures that Germany was suffering from as it industrialized, as it progressed through this period. And so what antitrust movement and FDR did is exactly that. They tried to avoid either Bolshevism on the one side or Nazism on the other side. And the generation that's gone through the First World War, has gone through Roaring Twenties, has gone through Great Depression, has gone through Second World War, appreciated the steadying hand of the government, appreciated the government as a guardrail. They saw how bad private sector can be at allocating capital. They saw how bad the private sector can be. And so they were prepared to sacrifice certain rights. So, for example, 1950s was not a liberal era in the US by any stretch of imagination. People traded some of their rights, some of their freedoms, for the steadying hand of the government. And it wasn't until later in 1960s, the late 60s in particular, that the baby boomers, who have not experienced dislocations, they have not experienced any of that very bad stuff, said, look, I want freedom. I want to choose who I marry or I don't marry. I want to choose what country I go to. I want to choose who I'm employed by, how I get paid. And so that was your beginning of baby boomers revolution. And on their shoulders, clearly Ronald Reagan and Maggie Thatcher and Bob Hawke and all those other guys came to power. Now, that age, and Kaletsky described it as capitalism 3.0, but whatever name you give it to it, that age, as I said, died about 10, 15 years ago. One can argue a little bit even more than that. And in between, there is usually chaos. So if you go to late 40s to early 60s, even mid 60s, there was a societal consensus in most countries. From mid 60s to 1980, there was anarchy, complete anarchy. And because society couldn't find the right answer, After 1980s, again, there was a consensus, illustrated by greed is good, Madonna, I'm a material girl, and the rest of it. There was a consensus that emerged. In the last 10, 15 years, again, we don't have consensus. And it will take probably another decade or so that the new consensus will emerge. It's driven partly, and I think Howe is right, by demographics. In a sense, it's driven by generational changes and how those generations have different experiences, and therefore it shapes the way they look at things. Partly it will be technology, partly it's going to be financialization, this Fujiwara impact that I've discussed, but there will be new consensus that will be forged. And it's almost guaranteed that that new consensus is going to be much closer to what I call enlightened communism than it will be to liberal capitalism. And in the U.S. context, an AOC-style presidency is almost guaranteed. It's just a matter whether it's going to be 2028 or whether it's going to be 2032. But mathematically, it's almost guaranteed that that will happen.
Distressing thoughts that, unfortunately, again, I agree there is much evidence in support of, right? Whether it is, if it is not an AOC, I think you are, an AOC carries significant risks associated with it, right? Because enlightened communism, when rejected by the populace, tends to turn into dictatorial communism. So it is very difficult to get the governing class to admit that they are wrong. You basically force a revolution. Now, I can feel a subset of the audience, particularly the audience that is tied into Bitcoin and the Austrian school, reacting with horror to the fact that we are continuing this conversation and that I've not insisted that you be taken out and summarily shot. What's your reaction to what I would describe as the rearguard attempt by that subsegment, right? The Murray Rothbardian Austrian school. What the problem is money. We need strong, hard money. We need to take away the capabilities of the state and preserve the rights of the individual. What's your thought on how that plays out, or how that influences what we're experiencing? And am I right that that's a rearguard reactionary event, much like the Luddites responding to the Industrial Revolution?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's the Luddites. And by the way, Luddites were not wrong. They knew that their pricing power, their utilization is being reduced by cotton looms. So they knew that. They knew their station in life is going to change. They knew their social status is going to change. And if somebody comes to the Luddites and say, look, you know what, don't worry, in 30, 40 years' time, it's all going to be okay, that's not going to be acceptable to Luddites, because that's the entirety of their life they're going to spend in this anger that they feel. So the problem with what Austrian schools is discussing is that we can't go back to this. This is neither socially, nor politically, nor economically, nor technologically acceptable, or even possible. And as I said, if we wanted to have debates about our future direction, we really should have had this debate in the 1980s. That would have slowed down technological evolution, would have slowed down financialization, would not have created this cloud of finance that is more than 10 times the size of underlying economies, that would not have separated real economy from financial economy, the extent to which it has been separated. By all means, have this debate, but this is debate for 1980s. This is not debate for 2020s. From now on, the only debate we have, how do we go forward? And the Austrian answer is not an answer, because it's predicated on a private sector primacy, which does not exist. It predicated that the money is something that kind of immutable and should be protected as a medium of exchange and a store of value, which it hasn't been for decades. It's predicated on individual initiative, where increasingly that is not the way we structure our businesses. That's part of the reason why a lot of forward indicators don't work anymore as well as they do, if you think of those leading indicators. Because if you ask a businessman, how do you feel? He doesn't know how he feels. Maybe he feels okay in the morning, but not so good tomorrow. Because most of the outcomes are beyond his control now. They're controlled by Federal Reserve. They're controlled by Treasury. They're controlled by geopolitics. They're not controlled by what he does. At the same time, as governments continue to compress business cycles, sometimes he's got a boom on Monday and a disaster on Tuesday. And as technology and the government effectively financialize the economy, we can have a deflation in the morning, a reflation in the afternoon, stagflation for tea time, and back to deflation in the evening. We can have the whole cycle essentially in a 24-hour period. Now, for Austrian school, that just doesn't work. And so I've used them more as a Luddite. Now, cryptocurrencies are something different because there is a possibility in what I've just described that some countries will really come to grief. And those are the countries which don't have monetary sovereignty. They don't have proper institutions of state. They have severe capacity bottlenecks. Some of those countries will really come to grief. But what I've just described does not describe the United States, does not describe Japan, does not describe China, does not describe most of Europe. It does not describe most of the developed economies. And so to me, this idea of cryptocurrencies being external, being not controlled by the government, there will be some kind of a monetary meltdown, doesn't work at all. Now, whether you can use cryptocurrencies for other means, and that's your DeFi, that's a different topic altogether. And I do think that you're going to have a significant revolution in banking and finance, much more than anything we have seen in at least 300-400 years. And that's all going to happen in the next 5-10 years. And I think that's something to watch.
So I completely agree with that. I actually make the exact same distinction and would suggest, as you alluded to earlier, that central bank digital currencies will sit at the center of that. The way I would describe crypto more broadly is digitally native securities, right? So instead of a QSIP written on a piece of paper filed away at DTCC, I have a digitally native security. I think there's a lot of stuff that needs to change before we get there, but I share that completely. And you definitely will have set off the hornet's nest by referring to the Austrians and Bitcoiners as Luddites. I didn't say it, you did. I'm joking. I said it first. Victor, this was an extraordinary conversation and a really great introduction. Now, if our audience wanted to follow your work, I know many of them are going to be clients of Macquarie in one form or another, or at least people will have access. Is there a way for those who are not institutional clients of Macquarie to access your work?
My regular work is Macquarie, so you do need to be a client of Macquarie. I'm quite active in LinkedIn, so you'll find a lot of my views I try to express there as well. And in terms of the book, The Great Rupture, it is available on Amazon, on Apple, or any way you would like to buy that book.
For sale through all sorts of corporate partners.
Correct.
Yes.
No, not corporate.
I'm joking. Victor, this was spectacular. I really, really enjoyed this conversation. I would love to do this again. I tend to try to have multiple conversations with people and explore topics over time. You and I could talk for hours. There's no question in my mind. Thank you so much for joining. Would you consider coming back and joining us in 6 months to revisit some of these themes?
Absolutely. I would love to. And it's an honor. I enjoyed our conversation. And as you said, we can talk for hours. Thank you for inviting me, Michael.
Thank you, Victor.